welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Thank you for joining us today on Jake Wynn's discussion of how Civil War medicine killed James Garfield. Jake Wynn is a public historian and tourism marketing professional. He currently serves as the Senior Marketing and Communications Manager for Visit Frederick, the destination marketing organization for Frederick County. He previously served as the Director of Interpretation both here and at our Clara Barton Missing Soldiers office located in Washington, D.C. He writes online at www.winninghistory.com and is a co-host on the podcast Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly. Enjoy. Thank you for coming.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hello. Can you all hear me back there? All right. Great. Well, it's great to be back here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's been 8 years of my early career working here at the museum, and as well as the site, as mentioned in the introduction, at the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum down in Washington, D.C. I came to this story in particular in 2016 or 2017 while working on a blog post about Clara Barton and her experience in Washington during the Lincoln assassination in April of 1865. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit as well. But that assassination and talking about that experience of Clara Barton during the Lincoln assassination, kind of another assassination that occurred in the same neighborhood caught my attention, and that was the assassination of James Garfield in July of 1881, just down the street from where Clara Barton lived during the Civil War. It took place after it happened in the summer of 1881. I'm, of course, not the first one to come to that story. I have the benefit of being able to utilize in my research a great baseline text to go to, and that is Candace Millard's Destiny of the Republic, which is an absolutely fantastic book. Highly recommend. And when I was giving presentations on this back during my time at the Civil War Medicine Museum, that served as a real help, and where we could really dive in, and where my expertise and the expertise of this organization comes in is the medical care that was administered to James Garfield, because it is not that dissimilar from what is given to Civil War soldiers 20 years earlier during the course of the American Civil War. And so I wanted to tell that story, and that's how this presentation came into being. Of course, a lot has changed since I first laid out this research, and in part that is public awareness of James Garfield. So I'm going to ask right away, how many of you have seen the Netflix series Death by Lightning? All right, great. For those of you that haven't seen it, I would highly recommend. It is very, very well done. It is really tells that story. It's based on Destiny of the Republic. It's based on books. It has a good base to build on. And the acting is pretty great. They do a good job of showing the political situation, especially that led to Garfield's ascendancy to the presidency, and then ultimately what transpires in the summer of 1881, leading up to his death at the hands of Charles Guiteau. One of the things that show doesn't get into, for all of you that have seen the show, they spend what I thought was a surprisingly little amount of time with the aftermath of the assassination and the medical care given. It is a very dramatic series of events that is going to lead to Garfield's death, and that is what we're going to be exploring today. So you can think, for those of you that have seen the show, read the book, that's kind of the prologue to this. This talk is really going to focus in on the events that take place once James Garfield is shot and laying on laying in a train station in Washington, D.C. with 2 bullet wounds. So as I get into this, into the presentation, I do want to just bring up that Clara Barton initiation for me to doing this is a quote from her from April 15, 1865, the day that Abraham Lincoln died of his wounds after being assassinated at Ford's Theater. She wrote in her diary, which is really a remarkable document in the collections of the Library of Congress. She said, quote, "No one knows what to do. And what I found remarkable about the connections between the events of April 1865 and the events of the summer of 1881 is just how many similarities there were, particularly when it comes to presidential security and what happens in the wake of the assassination of a president, or a president who is incapable of fulfilling their duty due to illness as well. That could factor in as well. But very little changes in the wake of the Lincoln assassination, in part because after the assassination in 1865, there is a feeling that that was an outlier, that the events that lead to Lincoln's death in Ford's Theater at the hands of John Wilkes Booth is really tied up in the conflict. It's tied up in the Civil War. It's coming, of course, in its final days, less than a week after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. And so in the wake of the assassination, there's not a lot that changed in terms of laws or infrastructure or security around the president. In fact, it's going to take another assassination in 1901 for there to be the Secret Service taking on a role in presidential protection. That's going to be the assassination of William McKinley. This is also a time period, just like in Lincoln's day. In 1881, when President Garfield is in the White House, it is incredibly easy to get into the White House. You can just walk in the door. There's very little security there, and that is a part of what was believed at the time to be part of the presidency, was access. The public could come in, they could lobby their case for clemency or for help. There were opportunities there for folks to walk right into the White House. Charles Guiteau, the assassin of James Garfield, is one of those people that is going to go into the White House himself, and he's going to be there, and that's where he's going to likely meet Garfield for the first time. Then you have the issue of presidential disability as well. This one takes a lot longer to be addressed. The 25th Amendment is adopted in 1967, and that is in the wake of the John F. Kennedy assassination. So you have a series of presidential assassinations, times where the president is incapacitated, and it is not addressed by our government assassination as well. And Bliss is going to become the one who is the most identified with the medical care administered to James Garfield, and that was on purpose. He decided that he wanted to be out front, he wanted to be the point person for this medical team, and ultimately he's going to be the one that's going to take the blame when all of this goes awry. So this is the story of a president, a madman's bullet, a doctor's arrogance, and the failure of the American medical community to adapt to the newest knowledge available in the field of medicine. So let's get into it. All right, so July 2nd, 1881. We're approaching the 4th of July holiday. And President James Garfield is preparing to board a train for Massachusetts. The 20th President of the United States was 49 years old at the time, a veteran of the American Civil War, as well as of the political wrangling that came in the decades after the American Civil War. He enters the 6th Street Station in Washington that morning, July 2nd, in the first summer of his presidency and amid a lot of turbulence within the Republican Party. The political chaos that's going on that summer is all about patronage. And that's that age-old American political technique to shore up political power by giving jobs to your friends. Garfield sought to reform this corruption-ridden approach to politics. Others in that establishment, if you will, sought to maintain the system which gave them both power and wealth. This rift threatened and eventually would drive a wedge in the Republican Party for the rest of the 19th century. This is what Death by Lightning, the show on Netflix, does a very good job of showing, that divide within the Republican Party that leading up to and through the Garfield assassination. So it's into this situation that we get this gentleman, the lower right-hand corner, coming into the story. His name is Charles Guiteau. He was 39 years old, and he becomes a bit of a political aspirant who wants very high jobs within the Garfield administration, though he has absolutely no qualifications for those jobs. He wants to be a minister to countries in Europe, but he's a nobody. He's come out of nowhere, and what he is most known for, both in Washington and elsewhere in the country, where he had gone, is mental instability, and many will refer to him as seeming insane in 19th century terms. He tries lots of things in his relatively young life. He tried law, theology. He lived in a free love religious community. Those of you that have seen Death by Lightning, you are very aware of that. And eventually turned to politics, which is, by the end of the 1870s, is really, again, it's quite a chaotic, roiling situation. And so he believed that he was meant, that God had a special plan for him, and that the ascendancy of James Garfield, who came out of nowhere to take the presidency in 1881, he believes that he has a role in the plan and the history of this country. And he is, again, like I mentioned, he's looking for a ministership or an ambassadorship in Europe, and he's lobbying for that. That's what brings him to the White House. But he's very troubled, and everyone that interacts with him can see it. When he's rejected, of course, for those jobs in the White House or in the administration or assisting the administration, he quickly pivots to believe that God has a plan for him to assassinate the president, to remove this object in the way of his rise politically in the United States. And so he's going to clear that obstacle by gunning down the president. This becomes his plan. He's going to start tracking Garfield across Washington in the spring and the summer of 1881. He's also going to purchase a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver as well. Garfield is unaware of this, that he is being tracked by Guiteau. Guiteau is there, he's following him to church. You see that in the Netflix series. That is true. Guiteau was following Garfield pretty much everywhere he went. He actually almost killed him earlier than July 2nd, but if you want to see his insanity and instability, he decided that he didn't want to shoot the president because at that moment, Garfield was with Lucretia, his wife, who was suffering from an illness, and that was in the newspapers at the time. And so he decided not to shoot Garfield because it would trouble Lucretia while she's ill. So that was his reasoning for not doing it earlier. But on July 2nd, as Garfield is walking through the train station with his two sons, as well as Secretary of State James Blaine, Guiteau stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired. The first bullet strikes Garfield in the arm at a glancing angle, which startles the president and prompting him to shout, "My God, what is this?" But before anyone could react, Guiteau fires the fatal shot, striking Garfield in the back and thrusting him to the floor in agony. And this gives you an idea. It's an illustration from the time of that scene. There are several illustrations made by those who are on the scene in the aftermath of the assassination. Guiteau is going to be quickly snatched. You can see that happening in this illustration as well. An angry crowd quickly assembles and is intent on killing him right there. But there are DC police officers that step in and arrest Guiteau and take him away. And they're going to go through his pockets. And in Guiteau's possession is a letter. And it gives the reasons for his actions. He says, quote, "Ingratitude is the basest of crimes. I had no ill will to the president. This is not murder. It is a political necessity. It will make my friend, Arthur, president and save the republic. I have sacrificed only one. I shot the president as I would a rebel if I saw him pulling down the American flag." So that's the mental state of this guy. He's a bit unhinged. And you can imagine the questions this would raise about Chester Arthur, the vice president of the United States at the time. Are you friends with the assassin? Because he says you're his friend. And this is where we're going to largely leave Guiteau. We're going to leave him out of the rest of our narrative, except for that bullet that he fired into James Garfield's back. We're going to be talking quite a bit about that. As for as for Guiteau, what happens to him, I think the show, Death by Lightning, as well as Destiny of the Republic, the book by Candace Millard, does a really good job of telling that story. So I'd highly encourage you to read those, to watch the show if you want to know more about Guiteau, who he was, what his motivations were, whatever those may be, and get an idea of what happened to him. But here's what ultimately happens. He's going to be put on trial. He becomes increasingly unhinged. He thinks he's going to be celebrated for his act. He thinks that people are going to come and liberate him from prison in Washington. Ultimately, he's going to be, that trial is going to convict him, and he is going to be hanged on June 30th, 1882. So like I said, we're going to leave Guiteau out of it from here on, and this is where the medical story really picks up. You get Garfield on the ground. In the moments after he's shot, he is laying in obviously great pain. A woman races to his side, lifts his head, and begins crying for someone to get him water. This is a spectacle on the floor of this train depot at 6th Street. Like I said earlier, for those of you that came in, is the location of this assassination. That train station is in Washington, D.C. It is essentially where the National Gallery of Art is located on what is now the National Mall today, where Garfield is shot. And it's crowded. It's a train station 2 days before the 4th of July holiday. There are hundreds of people around who witness this. It's very similar, I would think, is like if this had happened in an airport terminal today. It's very similar. There's people going everywhere, there's trains going everywhere, people from all walks of life are there as well. And they're all witnessing this. As this spectacle is taking place and Garfield's being lowered to the floor, one of Garfield's sons, 2 of them are with him at the time, bursts into tears at the sight of their stricken father and this shocking turn of events. Secretary of State Blaine is not the only cabinet secretary in the train depot at the time. Again, thinking of it like an airport depot or an airport terminal, everyone is there. One of those that's in the train station, that's in the cabinet, is Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln. So he is there, he witnesses these events, and races to the president's side, as did the Postmaster General and the Secretary of the Navy, all of whom were in the train station as this is happening. A bystander nearby remembered this. He told a newspaper reporter, he said, "I heard the whizzing of the ball uncomfortably near me." This would have been that first shot, that glancing blow that strikes Garfield in the arm. I was not over 7 to 8 feet from him. Mr. Garfield turned deathly pale, and soon after he was carried upstairs and vomited. The Washington Evening Star also reported on these events the evening of the shooting and said, quote, "Every garment, even his low-quarter shoes, was saturated or covered in blood." But within 5 minutes, the first doctors are going to begin arriving on the scene. Garfield's going to be moved upstairs to a more private part of the train station under orders from the first doctor on the scene. And a dirty horsehair mattress is going to be procured from somewhere in the train station, and the wounded president is going to be placed on top of it. So who are going to be showing up? The first responders. They're going to be getting here, again, within 5 minutes of the assassination, 5 minutes of the shots being fired. The first doctor that's going to show up is a guy named Dr. Smith Townsend, who's a health officer for the District of Columbia. I have not been able to find a photo of him, so he's our mystery guy on the left-hand corner. Dr. Smith Townsend. And as the president is vomiting while laying in this dirty bed, he began to drift into and out of consciousness. This is going to be the first symptom that's going to be treated by Dr. Townsend. He is going to administer brandy, as well as some smelling salts to revive Garfield. This is something that would be common during the American Civil War as well. Brandy or whiskey was often given near the scene of somebody being shot in order to treat what we would call shock today. So they give a little taste of that, try to revive, get the heartbeat up a little bit, and that was the idea there, as well as the smelling salts, to get him out of unconsciousness, bring him back. He then, the doctor, Townsend then examined the president and determined the location of the bullet's entry, and that the bullet was still inside the president. And this is where things turn ugly. I will give some warning. Throughout the rest of this presentation, there are some it gets a bit graphic at times, but it's necessary to kind of understand those comparisons to Civil War medicine. So just be warned, we're going to get a little gory through the remainder of this presentation. So while Garfield is laying on this nasty mattress, the doctor, Townsend, begins to probe the wound with his finger, unwashed finger, digging deep into Garfield's back in search of the bullet. Doctors are continuing to arrive on the scene. 10 of them ultimately are going to arrive while Garfield is in the depot. And another one of those doctors is this gentleman in the middle here. That is Dr. Charles Purvis. Purvis had just become the first African American to become head of a civilian hospital earlier that year in 1881. And he gained his first experience in treating gunshot wounds as an acting assistant surgeon with the U.S. Army during the Civil War. He's one of a handful of black doctors who was actually serving with the U.S. Army as an officer during the Civil War. But the man on which this story is really going to hinge is going to be our gentleman in the lower left-hand corner. That is Dr. Willard Bliss. It is Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln who summons Dr. Bliss, a man he knew and respected after his work during the Civil War, and as one of the physicians to attend his father after the assassination in 1865. Bliss arrives on the scene and immediately took charge. He examines Garfield himself and aggressively probes the wound with tools, again unclean, and with his finger, also unclean. He later writes, quote, "In attempting to withdraw the probe, it became engaged between the fractured fragments and the end of the rib. He actually had to push down on the broken ribs in order to pull the bullet probe out of the president." Now, several of the doctors who are there in the train station with the wounded president, including Charles Purvis, are going to attempt to stop Bliss from continuing this probing examination, which he's going to continue to do. They fail at this effort. And all through this, multiple probings of the wound, Bliss fails to find the bullet. And he tries different sizes of probes to get into the wounds, to find the bullet. He's never able to locate the lead ball. Now, Garfield does have a physician. And that is Dr. Baxter here, who is actually, this is a photograph from the collection here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in his Civil War uniform. And Baxter is refused access by Bliss. And it gets pretty heated, but ultimately Bliss is going to be the one who's going to take charge of the president's medical care. So, who is Dr. Bliss? We'll talk a little bit about him. So D.W. Bliss, as he goes by, he was quite renowned in Washington as a doctor, and he had extensive experience during the course of the Civil War. He was a native of Ohio, just as Garfield was, and actually knew Garfield prior to the assassination. He studied at the Cleveland Medical College, and when the Civil War broke out, became the regimental surgeon for the 3rd Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He served during numerous battles, treated the wounded well enough to receive an appointment as a regular Army surgeon in Washington. And he takes charge of the Armory Square Hospital near the Capitol in Washington, and was renowned for his work there. Armory Square, many of the photos you've seen, if you've seen photos of the inside of hospital wards during the Civil War, many of them were taken at Armory Square. It's definitely the most famous of the hospitals in Washington. And this is where Walt Whitman was going among the patients as a hospital volunteer. There are several nurses whose accounts have survived or published memoirs of their experience in Armory Square Hospital. And in part, it's because of its proximity to the Capitol. You get the photos here. It's right in the heart of downtown Washington. And this is located, just for your awareness, if you were standing where this photograph was taken, which these are some of the hospital wards here to the right, the hospital's chapel you would be close to the center of the National Mall, and to your right, where most of the hospital was located, is where the National Air and Space Museum is located today. So right there, and importantly for the hospital, it is very close to the city docks. The 7th Street and 6th Street Wharf is where many of the casualties being brought up from battlefields like Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, many of the wounded, very severely wounded, are going to be brought to Washington. They're going to tie up, the steamers are going to tie up at the docks, and then the wounded would be sorted there. And the worst patients, the ones who couldn't travel very far, they didn't want to take them in rickety ambulances across the city, the worst patients would end up at Armory Square. So this is where the worst wounds are going to be seen, the worst cases. And it's going to be Dr. Bliss who's going to be in charge of their treatment. He gains a great reputation during the course of the war as the head of this hospital. By and large, accounts from that hospital suggest that they did give really quality medical care considering the circumstances. And again, remembering that they don't understand about germ theory or antiseptic surgical techniques during the war. Everything's unclean when it comes to surgical instruments. But one of the things they learned during the war in places like Armory Square is that cleanliness does matter. So they do spend a lot of time of cleaning these hospital facilities, cleaning the sheets, cleaning the patients, making sure the walls are clean, open windows, fresh air. So there were things that were learned during the course of the war. But antiseptic surgical techniques, not one of them, importantly for what's going to happen to Garfield. So what happens to Bliss after the war? He is going to remain in Washington, D.C., but he's going to get himself in trouble in a couple of different ways among the medical practitioners in Washington. He is ousted from the District of Columbia Medical Society in the 1870s for his support of adding black doctors to the organization. And in this, he actually reached out to Congressman Garfield for support, but failed to regain entry into the organization without disavowing his support for African American surgeons. Additionally, he is experimenting with more of the kind of eclectic medical techniques that are out there in the 1860s and 1870s as well. Homeopathy is one of the techniques that he's playing around with, and that makes him pretty unpopular among some of the other surgeons in Washington at the time, the other doctors. So in order to regain his access to the medical establishment, he really is going to go back to what he practiced during the American Civil War. He's going to go back to what proved successful for him. And he's not going to be bringing on much new information. And new information like Joseph Lister's antiseptic surgical techniques. They're not going to be added to his treatment plans for his patients. And so he is going to provide, in the summer of 1881, medical care to the President James Garfield, that would be very, very similar to what a patient would have received at Armory Square Hospital. That is going to have some pretty fatal effects for the President. Now, talk a little bit about Joseph Lister. So we're going to cross the Atlantic, we go over to Scotland, and we're going to talk a little bit about Joseph Lister. So by the time of Garfield's assassination in 1881, Dr. Joseph Lister's medical revolution had already swept across the European continent. His experiments in antiseptic surgery had been initially performed in the 1860s, as the Civil War is coming towards its end, as Dr. Bliss is working inside Armory Square Hospital. Initially, doctors were hesitant to pick up on Lister's techniques, which involved using sprayers, like this one over here, to spray a diluted stream of carbolic acid on the affected area. Surgical tools, hands, and anything coming into contact with the open wound was expected to also be treated with that carbolic acid. With this and the advent of germ theory, which is coming along in the 1860s and 1870s as well, Lister's technique is going to become part of European medical culture. This was often painful for Dr. Lister because he is received with a healthy dose of skepticism while he's getting this technique out there in Europe. He's often ridiculed in the 1860s and 1870s for what was considered a very progressive technique. But the medical community could not argue with his success. His patients often lived, and you could not argue with that. And So it sweeps across Europe. In the United States, it's much slower, much to Lister's frustration. It does not catch on as quickly. And so when Bateau's bullet tears through James Garfield, the doctors overseeing his care would be using unwashed hands to probe dirty wounds without even a thought of the implications. They were adhering to the techniques that they were using during the course of the American Civil War, and they weren't going to change their mind. Back to July 2nd, 1881. So we need to move the president. He is laying on a dirty mattress in a train station in Washington. Where do you take him? This is the next question. Hospitals were still not considered adequate for a president. They were for common people. So where could you treat the president with some dignity? They're going to go with the White House. That was a terrible idea. The White House was not a healthy place. In fact, it was actually blamed for that illness that Lucretia Garfield had, that gave Bateau his reason not to shoot the president earlier. And it is the location of the White House near those kind of low, marshy areas, what is now the National Mall, that made it ripe for malarial conditions. It also had a major mold problem as well, and new advances in sanitation that had been added to the house. It meant that there were working toilets in the White House in 1881. But where did it all get flushed to? That's right. Right into the basement. So it was actually pumped out through pipes that were supposed to lead outside, but they were really old pipes they were trying to utilize, and it ultimately leaked back into the basement. So you can imagine what that smelled like. And this is where the president's going to be brought to after being taken out of the train station. And Dr. Bliss is going to almost immediately oust all of those other doctors who were around the president, and he is going to summon some of his friends and colleagues who he worked with during the American Civil War and who had a great reputation as medical practitioners. So for those of you that are familiar with Civil War medicine, these names will likely be familiar to you. There's Dr. David Hayes Agnew, who's the chief of surgery at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Frank Hamilton, a surgeon at Bellevue Medical College in New York City. Dr. James Woodward, president of the American Medical Association. Dr. Joseph Barnes, Surgeon General of the Army. And Dr. Robert Rayburn, professor of anatomy and surgery at Howard University. This is, I cannot express this enough, this is an elite team in the 19th century in America. Yet none of them were fully invested proponents of Lister's techniques. An additional person who's there, that's not in the sketch here, who's there, you'll see her in the later images, is a woman, a female physician named Susan Ann Edson, who was Lucretia Garfield's personal physician. She is also going to race to Garfield's side. She is going to be around for much of the events that are going to follow in the summer of 1881. And she is going to stand by, not as a doctor, but more as like a nurse and an attendant, trying to care for Garfield as she's watching Garfield get sicker and sicker over the course of that summer. And Bliss is going to start something right in the afternoon of July 2nd, 1881. He is going to begin submitting regular updates on the president's condition to the press. And this is going to be something that he's going to do right up until Garfield's death. Several months later. This is the first one he sends. July 2nd, noon. The president is somewhat restless, but is suffering less pain. Pulse 112. Some nausea and vomiting have recently occurred, and considerable hemorrhage of bleeding has taken place from the wound. He gives an update 2 days later on the 4th of July from the executive mansion, and he says, the president this evening is not so comfortable. He does not suffer so much pain in his feet. The tympanitis, which is swelling of the abdomen, essentially internal bleeding, is again more noticeable. Pulse 126, temperature 101.9, respiration 24. 3 days later, July 7th, 9 a.m., he writes, the president has passed a most comfortable night. I would argue with that. Think about this guy's a bullet, and I'm not sure about how most comfortable he could be. He continues to steadily improve. He is cheerful and asks for additional food. Pulse 94, temperature 99.1, respiration 23. The team is continuing to regularly probe for the bullet inside Garfield, and they are obsessed with removing it. These updates are going to be published in the press, and interviews are going to be conducted with Dr. Bliss and the others around the president. And this is going to be published pretty widely across the United States. This is going to prompt some members of those small groups of Lister proponents across the United States to begin writing letters to the White House, begin publishing letters in the press. One of those, which comes from Iowa, was written to Mrs. Garfield, and this is what this proponent of Lister said. Quote, "Do not allow probing of the wound. Probing generally does more harm than the ball. Saturate everything with carbolic acid, and God help you." I love that quote. This was ignored. Garfield's condition continued, was extremely painful and unpleasant throughout his ordeal. He's vomiting regularly. This was being exacerbated by the heavy food that was being given to him. He regularly threw up his meals and stopped desiring them altogether. Dr. Bliss, in an attempt to continue providing sustenance as the president was literally melting away in his bed, is going to begin performing rectal feeding 4 times a day with a mixture of beef bouillon, milk, egg yolk, and a bit of opium. So this is a condition, I think this is a statistic that really demonstrates what happens to Garfield that summer, what is happening as he's laying in his bed, paralyzed by his wound. Garfield was 210 pounds and quite vigorous when he was shot. By the time of his death, he only weighed 130 pounds. The bullet impacted his spine, and he could not feel his feet or his legs. Everything becomes quite miserable for him, and he was regularly in excruciating pain as infection slowly takes over his entire body. The president faced infected abscesses throughout his body, including near the path of the bullet and in his salivary glands, where they grew so large as to paralyze his face and nearly kill him by choking on his own blood when they burst. A little on Dr. Bliss and the situation he's facing here. At one point, he's denying that this is going badly. He's in denial. He's trying to put his best face on this as he can, but he should have understood how bad the condition was getting, because he actually cut himself while working near Garfield, and then went over to the wound, went over to Garfield, and he gets some of that infected material inside the wound on his finger. It swelled so large that he had to, it required him to wear a sling for his entire arm. That's how severe this infection was. All through this ordeal, Dr. Bliss continues to tell the American public that everything is going well and the president was recovering. Little side note here, you see it in Death by Lightning as well. Alexander Graham Bell shows up on the scene in the White House, and he's going to be involved in the search for the missing bullet. He had invented an induction balance device, which was essentially a crude metal detector, and he is looking for the bullet inside the president. He writes, quote, "It made my heart bleed to look at him, the president, and think of all he must have suffered to bring him to this." Bell's machine, though, fails to work properly, and the bullet wasn't located. He wrote, "I feel woefully disappointed and disheartened." And he never had a chance to continue working on it and fine-tuning the machine. Bell himself blames the malfunction on the brief time he had to assemble the machine before the test began, and for the metal springs in the bed throwing off the machine's delicate balance. So this is what you would be seeing if you were an American in the summer of 1881. Regular updates are going to be sent out to the press. You'd be reading about them in your local newspaper. Updates are being regularly published, and there was a group of journalists that were continually outside the White House that are going to be reported. This is going to be reported to. There's a quote that they referred to them as the nightly bulletin throng that was outside the White House. But by late August of 1881, the president's obviously not improving. And so begins to be a group of skeptics of Dr. Bliss. And one newspaper referred to Dr. Bliss as Bliss the Buoyant for all of his cheery notes about the president's care. But all through the summer, the situation is worsening, and ultimately Garfield is going to have a say he wants to have a say in essentially where he's going to die. I think he understood what was ultimately happening. And on September 5th, 1881, he is going to be moved across quite a bit of countryside from Washington, D.C. to Elberon, New Jersey, to a place called Franklin Cottage. And in order to move him, he wanted to be close to the beach. He wanted to be close to the ocean. He was long obsessed with the ocean. And so they create a special train for him, and they create a suspension system for the train, as well as for his bed on the train to minimize bouncing and shifting. There's also a lot of moving images as well. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, the train tracks ended in Elberon 3,200 feet away from the cottage. So a crew of workers went out and built 3,200 feet of track to bring the train directly to the cottage, so that they could carry the president into the house with minimal effort. Garfield reported, quote, "This is delightful. It is such a change." And he rallied briefly after being brought to Elberon. But things very quickly continued back on their inevitable path. And so on September 19, 1881, there's a dispatch sent out to the press. It says, though the gravity of the president's condition continues, there has been no aggravation of symptoms since the new bulletin was issued. He has slept most of the time, coughed but little, and with more ease. The sputa remains unchanged. A sufficient amount of nourishment has been taken and retained. Temperature 98.4, pulse 102, respiration 18. Sounds okay. But the next dispatch comes in at 11:30 p.m. on September 19, 1881. The president died at 10:35. After the bulletin was issued at 5:30 this evening, the president continued in much the same condition as during the afternoon, the pulse varying from 102 to 106 with rather increased force and volume. After taking nourishment, he fell into a quiet sleep. About 35 minutes before his death, and while asleep, his pulse rose to 120 and he was somewhat more feeble. At 10 minutes after 10 o'clock, he awoke, complaining of a severe pain over the region of the heart, and almost immediately became unconscious and ceased to breathe at 10:35. This dispatch is signed by D.W. Bliss, Frank H. Hamilton, and D. Hayes Agnew. The president's last words were reportedly, "This pain, this pain." The fate that had claimed so many soldiers during the Civil War had claimed President James Garfield. And now Dr. Bliss understood that he was going to be at the center of quite a firestorm in the wake of the president's death. There is going to be an official autopsy that's going to be performed by Dr. Woodward and Dr. Land from the Army Medical Museum in Washington. They're the ones that are going to head the autopsy. It's going to take place on September 20th, 1881, the day after the president's death. They're going to search for the bullets, and with the patient now succumbing to the wound, they are able to find that bullet's hiding spot. The bullet had fractured the 11th rib, smashed into the lumbar vertebrae, and come to rest behind the president's pancreas. The bullet rested on the left side of the president's body. Dr. Bliss and his team had convinced themselves it was on the right. The consistent probing of the wound had actually created an entirely new channel through Garfield's body, which was completely separate from where the bullet had gone. And this became a channel to carry infection throughout his body. Arguments over his death, there were arguments over his death. Some were pointing to a rupture of infection as being that pain that Garfield had reported at the time of his death. There's also, others had said it might have been a heart attack that had ultimately claimed the president because he was reporting the pain around his heart. Regardless, the president dies as a result of the massive infection that swarmed through his body that summer in the wake of the assassination. But the battle over who is to blame for the president's death, other than Charles Guiteau, is going to break out almost immediately. And everyone's blaming Bliss, understandably so. He has made himself front and center in the medical drama going on in the White House and then in New Jersey that summer. And so Bliss is going to try to right himself out of the situation, out of his tight spot, and he is going to write a defense of his medical treatment that is going to be given. He's going to say, as part of this, it's quite lengthy, but he says, quote, "The record which I wish to make now is not that of the surgeon, so much as that of the man who loved his patient. The official and professional reports are presumably complete. There can be little to add to them, save what unprofessional criticism may furnish." So he's basically saying that if you disagree with my statements, you are wrong and unprofessional. This is not effective at clearing Bliss's name. He continues to aggressively defend himself in the aftermath of the president's death, as President Chester Arthur begins his presidency. Ultimately, the death of James Garfield marks a bit of a turning point in American medicine. While the team of doctors who worked on the stricken president would consistently maintain they did everything they could, around them, American medicine was indeed changing. The success of Lister and his proponents in saving lives using the Listerian method catches on in America in the 19th century as it's coming to a close, and the dawn of American medical expertise had really begun. And soon American doctors were the ones making medical advancements unlike anything seen before. As for the death of James Garfield, I would say that this is one of the sadder chapters in our nation's history. This is a young president. He's only 49 when he ascends to the office and when he dies. He had a chance to make sweeping changes across America, which was struggling to unite itself in the aftermath of the Civil War. His death, ultimately, I would contend, was somewhat unnecessary, and represents how backward American medicine had remained following the Civil War. Progress was made during the conflict, but afterwards, new science was largely ignored by the American medical mainstream at the time of his death. And by the time the Garfield assassination had the effect of really shocking the American medical community. These debates around Bliss and his medical care that he administered really get a lot of conversations within the American medical community going. And by the time you get out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, as I mentioned before, America has become really a medical powerhouse. There are many institutions, research institutions, that are helping to make American medicine extremely progressive. And that comes out of the aftermath of the Garfield assassination. But unfortunately for Garfield, that came too late. So that is the end of my presentation for you all. Thank you all so much for being in attendance today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. Yes?
So I always got the impression that the resistance to antiseptic medicine came from a sense that it was costly, it was time-consuming, but was there some sense that it could actually hurt the patient? Because it seems to me like when you're treating a president, cost and time, who cares, right?
Yeah. I would actually say a lot of what it had to do, and you see this during the American Civil War as well, there's a lot of ego. There's a lot of ego among the doctors who are treating patients during the Civil War. With Bliss, I think it comes through loud and clear that he has quite an ego. And there is a sense that this is such a revolutionary change in how you treat patients that it's almost as if it's saying like, you're really stupid. Like, how did you not know that you could be saving a patient's life? And so there is resistance to it. There is resistance to it as well. And you see this during the American Civil War. When it came to debates around whether or not to amputate arms and legs or do these more advanced, more difficult procedures called resections. And what happens is these doctors that are out there in the field, they're getting told information from the Army Medical Museum that amputations are safer. But there are doctors that continue to perform resections because they think they know best from their experience. There's also very entrenched ideas about it doesn't matter about the cleanliness and almost like the nastiness of a surgeon's apron and tools was almost like a badge of honor as well. And so there's just a lot of there's a lot of baggage that these doctors are kind of carrying with them. So I would say, I think you're right to point out that it would be a time-consuming process, one that really requires you to pay attention to making sure you're spraying all of that, making sure that it's being used effectively, and I think that there probably was a hesitation towards it because of that. But there's also, because it was European, there was a resistance to it as well. And that went both ways. I mean, there was American medical practices that Europeans are slow to pick up. Anesthesia is one of those in the years before the American Civil War, where we start playing around with chloroform and ether in the 1840s, and it's proven quite effective, but it's slower to catch on in Europe, in part because of some of these, the time-consuming, the ego bit of it. So I'd say there are numerous factors that lead into it. Yes?
So I think, too, that the nurses, with their direct experience with patients, knew a heck of a lot about curing patients, but they weren't listened to because of the social misogyny of the period. Women were just not respected and loved or appreciated, or, they were just, treated. Yeah. And I think, because when you read about Florence Nightingale in Crimea, the hospital finding the dead horse in the water supply, and noticing the soldiers kept dying in this one position where the vent was venting out the air from where that dead horse was, and she just was, screaming bloody hell, to open it up and find it. I think that was happening a lot. When you read the nurses' diaries, they talk about all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a factor in when you're looking at Civil War medical care. I think, there is such a separation between the doctors and the nurses. The nurses are there all the time, and they are picking up on these things that are affected. In part, the cleanliness of the hospital is one of those things. Just with Florence Nightingale and others, they see the benefits. They see these patients are having better outcomes when they are clean, when the sheets are clean, the clothes are clean, the wounds are kept clean, the windows are open, and they have that idea about fresh air as being so effective in making sure the patients are going to survive. In this situation, it's Lucretia's physician who kind of serves in this role. She is a doctor, but she is relegated to this more of a nursing role and kind of an attendant getting the president what he needs, and she is quite loudly voicing her concerns about the medical treatment that is being given to the president, and she is largely ignored by Dr. Bliss. Yes?
Two quick questions. First of all, did they look at the lungs in the autopsy and what did they find?
I would assume that they did. I did not look at that. I mostly was looking my research at what they were reporting about, what the heart or the pain was at the end, as well as looking more at the infection and the bullet side of things. But they would have looked at the lungs. The report is available online, which I would recommend. Almost all of this content is available online in the public domain, so you can find this report on the autopsy there as well. So.
The other thing was, how soon after that did X-rays become available?
Ooh.
Because I know they were available when Teddy Roosevelt died in the early 1900s.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I would say it's more towards the 20th century. That's going to be more common. So. And if anybody else knows that, feel free to shout. But great questions. Yes, sir.
You said that Dr. Bliss cut out Garfield's personal physician. Do we know if he would have done the same thing or not? Or do you guys think about bringing him to Bliss or ideas too?
So he was more in the category towards listening to new ideas, from my understanding. There is, and I had this discussion after giving this presentation about whether or not Garfield could survive this. I think that there are some very good, there's some very good arguments that I've heard that if he had received care more like the privates and the corporals in Armory Square Hospital, when there was a hospital full of 1,000 patients, and they didn't give them the individual attention and the daily probings, that Garfield could have survived. or at least lived longer. I do think, and I've heard arguments recently in the wake of death by lightning and talking about this, that it is almost nothing that they could have done in 1881 would have kept the president alive for an extended period of time. He likely would have succumbed to the wound eventually because he was paralyzed from the sight of the wound getting down. His life would have been extremely difficult and painful. He may have lived longer, but likely the wound would have proved. They just didn't have the knowledge and the awareness and the ability to allow him to go about his life for very much longer than he did. But it would have probably been a lot, wouldn't have been so ugly in that case, most likely. Yes?
I'm not sure if I might have missed it, but do we know what his wife had or theories of what illness his wife had?
So it was probably malaria, which was extremely common in Washington, in part because it's kind of built next to a swamp. And lowland, marshy area, and yeah, malaria was rife in the city, and would have been quite common for especially for newcomers to the city, as well as there were often coming in and out because of the nature of politics. Malaria was something that many newcomers to the city were affected by. Yes.
I was hearing that his fever, 98, and then boom, he's dead. Is that true that the fever didn't continue to elevate despite the infection, or was there a period there where it did elevate and I just didn't hear that?
Yeah, so it goes up and down through this reporting. Throughout the summer, you can go into any newspaper archive and basically see a blow by blow of the course of his treatment. There at the end, they're reporting out publicly that it's 99 in that last report. There is a healthy dose of skepticism that needs to be given to all of these reports, especially towards the end, because it was becoming very clear that how this was going to end. And I think there's a bit of Bliss and the crew around him being like holding on hope against hope that they're going to get out of this somehow, and they're just trying to stave off criticism another day. So I would say, especially towards that last month when they moved him, take those reports with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Can you say anything about the subsequent life of Bliss? What did he do after that? What was his life like?
So he continues being a doctor. He is never able to get the stink of this situation off of him. This is actually one of my critiques of Death by Lightning, of the series on Netflix, because they have Dr. Bliss being there at the autopsy when they're reporting on where the bullet is and the separate channel of the bullet where the probes had actually gone and spread infection through his body. They have him saying, essentially, kind of like, oh, I think we did something wrong here. He never did that. He was fighting tooth and nail for his reputation for the rest of his life. He never really does that level of contrition about his role in the president's staff. It's a last question.
So I think you mentioned at a train station a few doctors tried to stop Bliss. I guess my question, why did no one ever succeed at kind of taking the reins from him? I mean, was there anyone in government that gave him the thumbs up and kind of made him the one, or was it just nobody was able to kind of talk louder than him?
Correct. So he had a great reputation. He's known in Washington. The Secretary of War, Robert Todd, was the one that brings him in initially. And he takes control because he is a well-respected doctor. There are no systems in place anywhere around this situation. There is no planning for this. There is no plan in place for who is caring for the president, who is supposed to care for the president. There is no infrastructure around the presidency to really deal with this. And what I find shocking is that it never really develops until the 20th century. And it's going to take another assassination in 1901 to even bring the Secret Service in to give the president a protective detail. And another area of this is less related to the medical side of this. One, it has to do with presidential disability. In the entire summer of 1881, basically the United States didn't have a president. There is no mechanism for Chester Arthur, the vice president, to take control. Because in the Constitution, the Vice President does not have that ability. In the case the President is still alive, he is still the President. And the Vice President cannot kind of go beyond that to take control. So essentially the country's leaderless. And this is going to really be addressed in the 1960s, in part because of, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination and because of the nuances and challenges of the Cold War. You needed to have the ability to instantly hand over power in the event that the president is incapacitated for whatever reason, whether it be violence or illness or disability. The other thing I want to say too is that it's less to do with medicine, and it's more to do with this actually is the beginning of an era of political violence. The Garfield assassination really begins to it's kind of a kickoff to what will be 2 to 3 decades of intense political violence, not just in the United States, but across the world. Anarchist violence, other figures like Charles Guiteau, mentally unstable, people with visions of grandeur, people with politics that would go to similar to what communism would be as well. And this targets not just political figures, royalty in Europe, the Tsar of Russia, but also business figures like Henry Clay Frick, who shot in his office in the 1890s, a steel executive. This really kicks that off, and that's a whole other fascinating element of the Garfield assassination, is that it kind of ushers in this age of political violence, which is one that is really interesting to study because there are some obvious and unfortunate parallels to what's going on in the country and around the world today. This is a really important time period. The 1880s and the 1890s have a lot to say to us today. There's a lot of similarities in the medical care. Thank goodness it's come a long way. Oh, last question. Or comment.
Well, but looking at presidential treatment, I'm going to think back on George Washington. And I think there was 3 doctors with him, and they knew he had quinsy, and they knew that they could pierce the throat and open up and give him oxygen, and do it, but they've never really done it. I mean, the Quakers were sort of known about it, but they held back because they didn't want to be blamed for killing him. But here we see with Garfield, this man has a tremendous ego, and the other doctors who sort of stepped back. Is it that they just didn't know and they were afraid of being blamed? So they just, okay, bless you, take him on with it.
Yeah, it was. He really just forced everyone else out. Yeah, he shuts everybody else out. Great. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming today, for being here. And yes, if you have not, make sure you sign up for updates from the museum in the back of the room. And if you're not members of the museum, I don't work here anymore, but I'll still do the membership pitch. Become a member. Support this organization. They have some really cool things happening in the next couple of years. There's redesign of the galleries here, some exciting things happening. So make sure, those of you in the room and out there online, to be able to sign up for a membership and support the museum. Thank you so much.
I really like it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Cool.
Joe, $5.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy your time in Frederick.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, that's let's say I worked so heavily in Civil War time period now.
Yeah.